Ain't every day we get visitors in Riverwood. How about you smith me an iron dagger? Here's everything you need to make one. Go ahead.
Skyrim. What a game. Released on November 11th, 2011, this 7-year-old game has carved out a place for itself in gaming history. It's one of my favorite games, and it's a game I come back to time after time. Today's prop build will be the Iron Dagger from Skyrim.
Some may call this junk. Me, I call them treasures.
Getting reference for this project is incredibly easy. Just go onto Google and type in Skyrim Dagger. I usually look for orthographic views first, especially when recreating something because it lets me see the dimensions of the object I'm making, and it's easier for modeling. Whether I'm making something that already exists or making something that is completely new, reference is always one of the first things I look up when starting a project. I usually collect a bunch of different images and I put them all into Photoshop to use as inspiration when modeling. Another way to get very accurate reference is to just go into the game and take screenshots of the prop. The great thing about Skyrim is the props that you collect, you can actually tumble around in your inventory to see it from every single angle. After I find all the reference that I need, I go into Maya and I upload the image planes, and then I get an idea of how big the blade I want to be. So I then use the measuring tool to adjust the size. Once I'm confident with the reference, I move on to the modeling. I start all of my models pretty simplistically. For this dagger, I just start with a cube. I start manipulating the cube by drawing it out and matching its vertices to my reference. I then use edge tools to define the geometry and start making a more complex shape out of the cube to match the shape of the dagger. Since this is just a prop blade, I don't actually want it to be sharp, so I made it a bit thicker. That way it gives the blade a bit more strength and it makes it less likely to hurt anyone. Rather than extruding the details out of the existing cube, I added additional geometry since I will be combining these shapes later on in a different program. Originally, I had the idea of making the entire piece as 4 pieces. I had the blade, the guard, and the grip, and then a spine to connect all the pieces. Besides just making it a little bit easier to connect the pieces, it also would have been a little bit stronger. Think of it like the Shrine of the Silver Monkey from the Legends of the Hidden Temple. There was this 3-piece puzzle that, for whatever reason, nobody could ever put together. And just like those kids struggling to put that 3-piece puzzle together, I struggled to print and assemble this design. On the blade, I created a negative boolean so that the spine could fit through the blade. The problem with this is it took surface area away from the bottom of the blade where it would attach to the build plate when it was printing. Since I was building the blade vertically, there was already a high chance of the blade getting disconnected from the plate. The loss of surface area caused 2 failed prints. Not to mention the boolean was too big, which made the walls too thin, which then resulted in holes in the blade. And after being frustrated for a bit, I realized I made this process so much more complicated than I needed it to be, and I ended up just scrapping the idea of the spine completely. The final result being the blade, the guard, and the grip. Another realization when I was modeling was that the grip was going to be pretty small. So deviating from the reference, I decided to make it a little bit bigger by extending the grip and making it a little bit wider to fit my hand. Once I was happy with all the pieces, I then put them into ZBrush and gave them their final detailing. I added scratches and nicks to the blade edge to give it a bit more of that worn feeling. I added hammer marks to the guard and smoothed out a little bit of the harder edges. For the grip, I just added some deep scratches to simulate wood grain. After I was done, I combined all the pieces and Dynameshed them. I gave them my final run through just to make sure that everything looked pretty good before printing. Once everything checked out, I was ready to move on to the next part. Printing is fairly straightforward. I just load my files onto the SD card, I pop them into the printer, choose the file, and then I just let it run. I recently picked up the Prusa 3 Mark II kit. The kit was so much fun to put together. For anyone looking to pick up a printer, I would definitely recommend picking up a kit, because that way if anything ever fails, you have a better idea of how to take it apart and put it back together. Also, it's just a lot of fun. The first part I printed was the blade. The blade was printed at a 0.15mm layer height and a 20% infill, so pretty much just standard printer settings. The blade took about 4 hours to print. Second was the guard, which I printed at a 0.1mm layer height, 20% infill, and it took about an hour and a half to print. The grip was a little bit more difficult to get to print. Like the blade, it was printed vertically. It had a very small footprint, so it would always get to a certain point before becoming detached and failing the print. I didn't want to have to add supports because I figured I might lose some detail and it would take a little bit longer to print. But after another failed attempt without supports, I just gave in, and to my surprise, there was no loss of detail at all. It was printed at a 0.1mm layer height, 20% infill, and this one took about 6 hours to print. So the total time for this prop, 11.5 hours. Now, although the prints came out pretty clean, I still wanted to sand them down to get rid of as much of the build lines as possible. I started out with 120 grit sandpaper to remove some of the heavier build lines and define some of the edges. I then moved to 500 grit to smooth out the parts. I had to be careful on the grip because I wanted to remove the build lines, but I wanted to keep the wood grain detail, so I only used 500 grit on the grip. After I was happy with how the sanding came out, I then super glued some little bamboo skewers to the pieces that wouldn't be seen on the blade. This is just to help hold the piece when you're doing your priming or painting, so that way you don't get it all over your hands. After each piece was primed, I then just stuck them into a little piece of foam and let them sit outside so that they could completely dry. After drying, I realized I wanted the blade to look a little bit more hammered and pitted. I figured this would add a little bit more uniqueness and depth to my prop as well. Using my Dremel and one of those spherical engraving bits, I started carving divots into the blade. And at first I panicked because I wasn't a big fan of how it was turning out, but after working on it a bit more, the design kind of grew on me and I ended up being pretty happy with it. Using my acrylics, I used silver as a base for the guard and the blade. I like to build up my paints in layers, so I used a little bit of water with it just so I could creep up on how much shine and silver I want in the blade. I do the same thing with the black. I combine a little bit of water with the black, and then I just layer it onto the blade. I make sure to wipe off some parts and keep some parts a little bit darker, just so it looks a little bit more weathered in certain parts. The grip was similar, but I started with a coat of brown. Then using as steady of a hand as I could, I painted those little thin silver bands. In the middle of the grip, you could see this big open area that's just, I guess, more wood in the reference. But I liked the idea of making it silver instead. So that's what I did. I just made it silver instead. And that's the fun thing about prop building, is that you can do anything that you want. You can make it as accurate as possible. You can add little twists of your own to things. It's really just up to you, and that's what makes it so great. After laying the base coat on the grip, I then went back and hit it with that black wash just to give it that weathered and dirtied look. I let the acrylics dry for a few hours, and then looking at the pieces one more time, and after doing the final look over for these pieces, and once I was satisfied with how they looked, I then took them to a well-ventilated area, and I sprayed them with a can of fixative. Fixative is just clear coat, but it's used to prevent smudging, yellowing, and fading of the paints. And after all that, the prop is finished. This was the first project I took from start to finish using my new 3D printer. Despite the few pitfalls, the project was a lot of fun, and I plan on making many more props, objects, and other oddities. I'm happy with the way it turned out, and I feel like I learned a lot about the process. Skyrim's a game that holds a near and dear place in my heart. As I've spent around 600 hours, which I'm sure is nothing compared to some of you guys, but I just love how rich the lore is. I love the level design, I love the characters, and those puzzles. Anyways, if there's a prop from a show, game, or just anything that you'd want to see, let me know in the comments and I might make it in the future. But that's all I have for today. I appreciate you stopping by. Remember to subscribe. Banehorse, signing off.